Call the honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Pleased to speak on the Trade Legislation Amendment Bill number 1 of 2016 this afternoon. If I'd like to start saying I was very disappointed with the member for Rankin in his speech, Deputy Speaker. He sort of said that he gave the impression that this bill was unworthy of the House's time. And he clearly, Deputy Speaker, did not understand the importance of the Export Market Development Scheme to this nation, to our exporters, and to the future prosperity of our nation, Deputy Speaker. 98.5% of the world's commerce occurs beyond our shores. And, Deputy Speaker, what is going to drive the future prosperity of our nation is innovative, risk-taking, experimental small businesses taking risks to take their products offshore and to sell them in those markets, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, that's why the free trade agreements, the trade liberalisation agreements that this government has struck with China, with South Korea and with Japan are so important. And for the alternate Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Deputy Speaker, to come in here and sort of play down the importance of this bill, Deputy Speaker, was very, very disappointing. He simply doesn't understand the importance of this legislation. And also, Deputy Speaker, to hear him claim that the coalition somehow has some anti-business approach regards to this. Well, Deputy Speaker, I would remind the member for Rankin that it was the Labor Party, Deputy Speaker, that slashed the funding for the Export Development Grant Scheme when they were in government, Deputy Speaker. They slashed it from $200 million, Deputy Speaker, back to $125 million. That was how much they slashed it, Deputy Speaker. And yet, we know the KPMG reports, Deputy Speaker, show that this scheme, for every dollar of government investment, it's a $7 return, Deputy Speaker, to the economy. 7 for 1. Yet, Deputy Speaker, the former Labor government had money to spend and throw everywhere, yet they slashed this scheme back, Deputy Speaker, from $200 million to $125 million. Now, Deputy Speaker, we do not have an unlimited budget. It would be very nice if we here in the coalition government could put it back and restore that funding back to $200 million and then index it, Deputy Speaker. But in the times that we live, the budget constraints that we have, Deputy Speaker, unfortunately that is just not possible. But what we have done, Deputy Speaker, we've kept our election promise. We've increased funding for this scheme. There's another $12.5 million have gone into the 2014-2015 year. So the scheme now sits at $137.9 million, Deputy Speaker. It would be nice if we could increase it further, but we need, Deputy Speaker, to live within the budget restrictions that we have. It was also interesting, Deputy Speaker, the member for Rankin, as we said, talk about the anti-business approach of the coalition, yet, Deputy Speaker, he is part of a party that plans to increase capital gains tax by 50%. 50% increase. Deputy Speaker, what anti-business message does that send? If the members of the Labor Party, Deputy Speaker, are planning to increase capital gains tax in this country by 50%, Deputy Speaker, they are sending an anti-business message to every single investor, to every single business in this country, Deputy Speaker. They do not know the damage, Deputy Speaker, that they are preparing. Now, Deputy Speaker, it's also interesting to hear the member for Longman, the Assistant Minister, I should say, talk about that this bill was introduced in, or the scheme, Deputy Speaker, was the Export Development Market Scheme, was first introduced in 1974. Well, Deputy Speaker, I actually first applied for an Export Development Grant Scheme, Deputy Speaker, that's 8 years after, in 1982-83 year, Deputy Speaker. And I think I'm one of the few people, Deputy Speaker, in this place that has actually filled in one of these forms and actually understands the importance of it to small business and how it actually works, Deputy Speaker. I'll give you my example from how this is important to incentivise small business. My parents' company I was working for at the time, Deputy Speaker, we had been successful doing an export job in Singapore for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel at the time. This is back in the mid-1990s. And Deputy Speaker, it was very successful, created a lot of jobs, a lot of employment, a lot of work for people here in Australia. And Deputy Speaker, at the time we thought, was this just a one-off, or is this a market up in Singapore that we should worth exploring more? And I can remember, as I said, Deputy Speaker, this Export Development Market Grant Scheme was available. So we decided on the back of that scheme, Deputy Speaker, to take the risk and to participate in a trade fair in Singapore. It was an expensive exercise, Deputy Speaker, because you need to design a stand, you had to make the samples, you had to pack them up, you had to air freight them up to Singapore, you had to fly up yourself, you had your accommodation on the ground, you had the cost of going in the exhibition, Deputy Speaker. It was an expensive exercise. And it was a risk-taking exercise, Deputy Speaker. But what tipped the decision in the favour of doing that, Deputy Speaker, of taking that risk, was the fact that we had that Export Development Grant Scheme behind us. We would have to cough the money up front, Deputy Speaker, but there was a little bit of a kick, a little bit of a relief there, Deputy Speaker, from government to help offset some of those expenses down the track if it was unsuccessful. And Deputy Speaker, from that exhibition, I remember we actually wrote, I think, Deputy Speaker, following from the exhibition, about $1 million+ worth of orders that we would have never, ever achieved otherwise. Purely because of this scheme, Deputy Speaker. And that's just one example of thousands and thousands of companies that have taken advantage of this most important scheme. So, Deputy Speaker, contrary to what the member for Rankin says, this is a very worthy bill to take the time of the House and to spread the message to all those small businesses out there in the country today that are looking how they can expand their business and thinking what they can do, Deputy Speaker, because I would say, Deputy Speaker, to most businesses in Australia today, look at what you can do in the export market. We are in a unique period of human history. Never before, Deputy Speaker, have we seen so many people lift themselves out of poverty into the middle class that can become consumers for goods made here in Australia. And Deputy Speaker, that Made in Australia brand, that carries a lot of weight, Deputy Speaker. We no longer, Deputy Speaker, it's not all about competing on price. It's about competing on quality and style, and with that Australian-made logo behind, Deputy Speaker. It's the high end of the market, Deputy Speaker. That's where our future prosperity lies. So we need to do as a government every single thing we can to encourage businesses to go out there and take that risk and explore those markets, and for the member for Rankin not to understand the importance of that and to come into this chamber and sort of say, oh, this bill's all just a waste of time, Deputy Speaker. Frankly, it's a disgrace. Now, Deputy Speaker, what this bill actually does, since this scheme has been going since 1974, there have been 4 yearly reviews. This legislation gets rid of those 4 yearly reviews, Deputy Speaker. Each review has been important. Each review has made minor changes, Deputy Speaker, but we think this scheme should be legislated. There should be no sunset clause, and that's exactly what this does. So what the message we're sending to Deputy Speaker, to small businesses out there, this is how the scheme works. If you have eligible export promotional expenditure, the first $5,000 is not counted. Above that, Deputy Speaker, you are able to get a reimbursement of 50% of all your eligible expenditure, and you're able to get grants for 8 years. They can be consecutive years, they can be years spread out each other. After the first 2 years, Deputy Speaker, there is an export performance test to make sure the grant money is being wisely given out and people are spending it wisely. And the maximum grant, Deputy Speaker, is $150,000, although as the Assistant Minister said, it averages the last year it averages $44,000. Deputy Speaker, that is the message that we should all be selling and sending out to our small businesses, Deputy Speaker, in our electorate, to encourage them to get out there, have a go and utilise the scheme. Deputy Speaker, there is a couple of changes in this legislation that I would prefer not to see there. One is the deletion of the the capping of the free samples provision. That is capped at $15,000. Deputy Speaker, I think that how each individual businesses determines whether they should do it between overseas representation, whether marketing consultants, marketing visits, trade forums, promotional literature or free samples. I think that should be left to each individual business, Deputy Speaker, rather than putting a cap in it. But I understand there have been times in the past where that may not have been used, those free samples may have been overclaimed. I wouldn't like to see that there, Deputy Speaker, but that is there. The other one, Deputy Speaker, is the removal also of the communications. There's someone that sat up at night and spent many long hours on the phone talking to customers over in the Middle East. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to see that communications still in there. But Deputy Speaker, although they are removed, this is still a very good scheme. This is still a very important scheme for our economy. It shows the commitment that this government has to the small businesses of this country. It shows the commitment that we have to risk takers and those that innovate and those that will drive the prosperity of our nation forward in future years. And with that, I commend this bill to the House.
I thank the member for Hughes.